Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, August 10th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, as Washington debates the future of the civil service, one legal scholar argues that a professional career workforce is more consistent with conservative principles than many people think. Plus, the federal government can track an award from Washington to a state government, but following it the rest of the way is often where the trail goes cold. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Army's decision to consolidate its official social media accounts is raising concerns well beyond public affairs. Small businesses that rely on LinkedIn, X, and other platforms to track contracting opportunities, connect with program offices, and learn about new requirements say they could lose a key entry point into the acquisition process. The move comes as Army leaders continue urging non-traditional companies and commercial firms to do business with the service. Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen has more on what this could mean for the Defense Industrial Base. Rachel, great to have you. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, Terry.
What is really happening here? What is the Army changing in its social media presence, and why has it caught the eye of companies?
Yeah, the Army is shrinking the number of official social media accounts it uses. So all of the kind of lower level offices, unit level social media accounts are no longer authorized. So they're really kind of centralizing their messaging under the high level offices. So the secretary's account, chief of staff, SMA, the commands, the installations themselves instead of the lower units on the installations. So, the goal, it says, is to speak with a unified voice, protect OPSEC, and, it says do a better job of informing the public and families. Whether or not that plays out, we'll see. But, some of those accounts on the chopping block are the ones that small businesses and, the acquisition community at large rely on to learn about industry days, contracting opportunities, outreach events, things like that. So the concern isn't really about losing posts on, Twitter or LinkedIn specifically. It's more about losing that direct, very easily updatable line to the acquisition community.
It feels like the pendulum is swinging back then, because for years, the Army and probably the other services have looked at social media as a way to reach their interested community, their families, their clients, and their contractors as well. So when it's swinging back, what is the access that small contractors especially will lose in the process? Yeah,
so instead of having people find things through, a platform like LinkedIn, the Army is saying, all right, all of our stuff is going to be posted on official websites, go there instead. The issue with posting on official websites is that's often a slower process, requires contractors in a lot of cases, they outsource website management and that kind of thing. And it's not like a social media platform where you can just go and comment, right? It's not the same sort of posting like, here's this, opportunity to provide a, subcomponent of, whatever system. And then an interested business could say, oh, I love to see this, right? It's just that more, kind of conversational, kind of, a more informal way of industry being able to find things. So, they'll be posting them on official sites. They'll be posting them on sam.gov like usual. But, it really losing that type of communication means that small businesses have to have a little more granular knowledge of how the very wonky defense contracting system works. And it means, that doesn't really give them the ability to sort of build those personal relationships like you can build through social media.
The Army says it's trying to attract more innovation and commercial technology. What impact do you think this change in policy will have there?
It could. On the one hand, you have the defense secretary and the services saying we need more new entrants, we need non-traditional contractors, really looking to the commercial sector for cheaper, faster procurement. If the commercial sector has a harder time navigating the system, right, they might miss out on opportunities that they may have otherwise seen. And so one person who spoke to me said, it's not necessarily that there won't be any contact, between small businesses and the Army, because, there's still other avenues. But as the Pentagon is trying all of these new ways of bringing in companies, all these new contracting vehicles that are not necessarily the traditional process, there's a lot more for companies to know how to navigate. It's becoming more of an alphabet soup of contracting possibilities. And so his point was understanding what the best route might be for a company to get involved in a program or to show off, whatever it's created, as well as, going through SAM.gov. Those postings aren't always written out as neatly or as accurately as they could be, right? Things aren't always titled very clearly. They're not always separated out in a way that makes sense. There's a lot of times when opportunities are nested under, other contract opportunities, other task orders. And so, it will make it harder for companies that don't have as much experience in that ecosystem to find stuff that they could offer that is innovative, right? That thinks outside the box a little bit more than, maybe the vendors that DoD currently uses.
As you've been talking with small business advocates and industry groups about this, do they have some things on their list that they wish the Army would do differently here?
They obviously want to keep as many lines of communication open as possible. One person said there are other tools that DoD could start using to kind of make postings a little less complicated, make them a little bit easier to find. He suggested maybe AI could help untangle that web a little bit. Others are saying, what's the point of this? The other services aren't doing this. This is a great resource for us, come back. The assistant administrator of NASA's small business office commented on the Army Small Business Office post and said, hey, come follow us instead. I think people are asking them to be clearer in other venues. And people are saying, okay, well, if we can't talk to the Army as easily, like maybe we'll go look at the Air Force or the Navy.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Rachel, thanks for bringing us this story.
Yeah, thank you.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, as Washington debates the future of the civil service, one legal scholar argues that a professional career workforce is more consistent with conservative principles than many people think. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Much of today's civil service debate focuses on giving presidents greater control over the federal workforce. But if you go back to some core conservative principles, the case for a professional, merit-based civil service becomes stronger, not weaker. Joining me to make that case is Christopher Walker, professor of law at the University of Michigan. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I'm really interested in your perspective on this topic because the current popular narrative says that conservatives and the professional civil service are fundamentally at odds. You argue that's historically inaccurate. So tell me more about your position here?
I guess I would back up and say I think that Republicans generally have, believed in a unitary executive, right? That the president should have the final say or control of the executive branch. And so there has been tensions between the civil service and that view, but we've got to a different level now on the right, and you see kind of this idea of this deep state narrative that the civil service is bad for Republican administration. And I argue in an essay that's not true. I mean, if you care about limited government, if you care about the rule of law, if you care about predictability and stability in markets, you should really want to professionalize civil service as well.
You make a distinction between political accountability and professional expertise, and that is sometimes at the core of the conversation today. How do you think those two things are different? Why do you believe government needs both?
My vision, which isn't just mine, I think it's also a majority of the current Supreme Court, is that, at the end of the day, you have an agency head, the leadership of the agency that's appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and is removable at will by the president. In other words, if the president doesn't like what the agency is doing, the president can fire the agency head. Now, of course, there are costs to that. I mean, it's not like a free fire. I mean, they have to pay the political costs and get someone else confirmed or in that position. But underneath that, you have inferior officers, government officials, and the civil service. And the civil service is hired and fired based on merit. And the idea there is we're trying to get serious experts that are going to last beyond just one presidential administration. And they're there to provide their expert advice and recommendations to the political leadership. So in other words, they should have a degree of decisional independence to look at the facts, to make recommendations, to find facts and apply it to law to make policy. And ultimately, though, the agency head, if the agency head doesn't agree with that, can come in and say, no, we're going to do something different. And I think that's the model that kind of preserves both agency expertise and political accountability within the administrative state.
That has been the model that we've operated on for most of the recent past, but much of today's debate actually focuses on whether presidents should have more control over those career officials, those mid-tier folks who are actually executing and building policy and programs. So what does the political leadership gain if it has greater authority over hiring and firing of those folks?
I mean, so that's a short-term game. I mean, you can imagine when a new presidential administration comes into office, they're going to want to do a lot of stuff that the prior agency wasn't doing, and they may want to be really, really aggressive. And if you have a professionalized civil service in place, it's going to be harder for a new president to move very quickly. It's also going to be a lot harder for a new president to violate the law. In other words, to do things that Congress has not authorized that agency to do. And so if you're caring about the pure politics of that, you can imagine not wanting those barriers, or I might call it not barriers, speed bumps in the way of doing what you want to do.
But speed bumps are often there to help keep us safe. So what are the risks of taking this approach?
The risks are pretty clear, right? I mean, you risk the idea of a new administration coming in and not following the law, and not doing what Congress, the branch that we elect to make the law, has commanded that the executive branch do. And so you see agencies stray far outside their lanes. And not just that, they oftentimes do so without any expertise, right? And so even if you think this is good policy to change the way we regulate a particular market, if you don't have the expertise there to help guide that, even if it's going in a direction that's unlawful, but could be lawful if Congress passes a law, you end up with a really haphazard, unpredictable process. And it creates a regulatory environment that's bad for business, it's bad for individuals. And so I think that's one reason why you want to have a professionalized civil service. Now, I will say, I keep on using the word professionalized. I recognize that not every single person that works in the federal government is awesome, and some should be fired, on the merits. And we should be able to hire folks that are qualified. So I'm not saying the system is perfect, but I would prefer this with some speed bumps over a system where you don't have any at all.
Chris Walker is a professor of law at the University of Michigan School of Law. So, Chris, your article is called A Conservative Case for the Professionalized Civil Service. Make that case for me. What is the conservative case for a merit-based civil service?
Yeah, I will say this is more of a traditionalist conservative, markets conservative approach. And the idea here is that If what you care about is government moving slowly, if you care about government being predictable and stable, in other words, if you're running a business and you want to be able to invest for the next 20, 25 years, the civil service is going to help make sure that the regulatory environment is more stable, more predictable, more expert driven. And so while you still might have higher regulatory costs than if you had a president can't come in that just deregulated a whole industry, you can at least plan for and invest in your operations along those lines. So I think that's the business case. On the liberty case, whoever's in the White House is going to change. We're going to elect someone different from a different political party, a different perspective, and they're going to have different priorities, and they might be tempted to not follow the law. And that could be on the left or the right. And so if what you ultimately care about is that we're protected against government overreach, it might seem counterintuitive to some, but the civil service is a really key ingredient in that recipe of kind of controlling the government from going too far.
You're making the case for stable, predictable regulatory regimes that enable long-term investment in business. Sometimes in the current environment, we care more about fast change that feels different. So if an agency maybe has become too insulated or too resistant to presidential direction, how do you respond to that concern?
Yeah, so this is why it's important that the model that I'm advocating for has political accountability as well. Ultimately, if an agency head makes a lawful, command of the civil service of inferior officers and they don't follow it, that's grounds for firing, right? And so what you have in that situation is the agency head still has the ability to structure and control within lawful grounds. If they're fired, then that civil servant can bring a challenge in court. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but ultimately bring a challenge in court. And so they would be able to see whether it was a lawful command. But so long as it's lawful commands, the agency head does have a lot of control to do that. Now, is there still a cost of speed? Absolutely. I'm not going to deny that. Things are going to move more slowly in a government where we have a civil service. But candidly, if you look at the founding, the federal government was supposed to move slowly. The way we designed Congress, the way we designed separation of powers, the way we designed states, federalism system, we imagined that the federal government wouldn't have the capacity to move at warp speed, that there would be veto gates and speed bumps along the way. And those are there to help protect us, protect our liberty, and help protect stability in the markets.
So as agencies continue to adapt to the workforce changes under this current administration, what should policymakers be watching for to ensure that they preserve both accountability and expertise?
So, there are a couple different on the civil service side. One, and this is not like law, this is more politics, but there's definitely been a move to demoralize the civil service, and it's going to really clog the pipelines or discourage the pipeline from even going with respect to really professional, lawyers and policymakers and scientists and other experts from joining government. And so I don't know how to fix that. But I think policymakers need to be thinking seriously about how do we make this position, and maybe it's more pay, maybe it's more, resources or benefits. I don't know what it is, but I think that's something that in the next administration with a hopefully more vibrant Congress, they're going to do. On the other side, you also have, it turns out that Congress has allowed the president to have more control over the civil servants that have a lot of policymaking authority. And I candidly think that's a good thing. At some point, a civil servant goes from being an intermediate, like middle manager to an actual more higher ranking policymaker. And I think that's good. And President Trump has been very aggressive in how to categorize those that are in that higher level that he can more easily fire. And I think Congress needs to take a much closer look at that and figure out, are we striking the right balance there? Are we allowing the president to designate too many people, that are not quite at that highest level to fall into what we might call, we used to call it Schedule F. I think now we're calling it Schedule Policy/Career. And so that's an area where I think that Congress needs to take a closer look as well.
Chris Walker is a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. Thanks so much for joining me, Chris. I really appreciate your perspective on this issue.
Awesome. Great.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, before heading home for August, the Senate cleared a few items that could have lasting consequences. But first, the federal government can track an award from Washington to a state government, but following it the rest of the way is often where the trail goes cold. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Federal spending transparency has been a bipartisan goal for nearly 2 decades, and USAspending.gov was built to help taxpayers follow the money. But a new report from the Project on Government Oversight suggests that much of the accountability challenge begins after dollars leave federal agencies and move through states and other intermediaries. Joining me to explain what government can and can't see today is Sean Moulton, Senior Policy Analyst at Pogo. Sean, welcome back to the show. It's great to see you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Pogo has a new report out that looks at USAspending.gov and particularly how well it documents where public assistance funding is actually spent. What specifically were you looking at and looking for in this report?
What we wanted to try and figure out is how well can we follow money from federal agencies all the way down to the community level. It's a critical function. I mean, we don't want to just know what money got spent in what program. We want to know where it went. We want to know what it was used for. We want details. You know, it's one thing to say it was spent on highways. You know, was it spent on my highway? Was it spent on a highway I know needs it? And so it's good that we have a window into this through USAspending.gov, but how good is that window? How clear is it? How far can we see? And so that was really our goal here, because we've been advocating for years for improvements. I love USA Spending. I use it all the time. I think it's a great website, but there are limitations. And this was really an exploration into those limitations.
You looked at 60 of the largest domestic-focused federal assistance programs. Which ones are we talking about there? You mentioned highways. I'm assuming Medicare and Medicaid have got to be in that list, right? What else were you looking at?
Absolutely. A lot of big ones people would know. Social Security benefits, disability benefits for veterans, you know, assistance for some of the big housing programs, mortgages, mortgage assistance, things like that. And so we're talking education programs like Title I, you know, SNAP, which goes out, you know, to almost every community in the country. And so these are big, big programs. And that 60 program, you know, what it got us was, you know, more than, I think, 95% of federal assistance spending. So even though we looked at, I mean, there's more than, I think, 2,000 assistance programs, but even if you just look at that top piece, you get most of the spending by far.
And as you followed the trail on those 60 programs, the headline finding here is that more than 74% of grant program funding could not be tracked to the local level. How does that even happen?
So grants, especially the big grant programs, a lot of it goes from federal agency to a state agency. So it goes from DC to a state capital someplace. And that's, you know, whether it's education or transportation. And very often that prime award, that first award, because it's going to a state agency and it's probably covering a lot of different work inside that state, it doesn't have any information about where the money's going because it's a really big pot of money. What the website has, though, it has the ability to report subawards. So then the state, you know, the state agency can then report in, what do we do with it? Where did it go after we got it? And that's where I think a big part of these breakdowns happen, is that we're not seeing that subaward data reported reliably, accurately, completely. And so that's why grants were such a big problem. The money kind of went to the state agencies. We see it. We see those prime awards, and then it disappears.
And so why does that matter?
Because, you know, just knowing that your state got the money really isn't enough. I mean, most people, they want to know where it went. I mean, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. I mean, we're talking about money that can be defrauded after the states get it, you know, questionable spending where some communities are left out. Some communities get, you know, award after award after award for their roads or their schools. And there's a community that needs the money and is not getting left behind year after year. And if we can't see where the money's going, then we can't see those patterns, those questionable patterns, outliers, strange decisions. And so being able to follow this money all the way down really is about having some accountability, having some, you know, answers to very fundamental questions.
Sean Moulton is Senior Policy Analyst at the Project on Government Oversight. I would imagine it's also instrumental in being able to articulate the impact of these programs, right? There are multiplier effects when highway, refurbishment grants get spent in a particular place. It makes a difference economically. Same sort of thing with disability insurance and Social Security payments and all of those things.
That's a great point. I mean, this really is about, delivering benefits to communities, benefits. Their taxpayer dollars, went into the federal government, and they want to know how much is my community get benefiting from those dollars? What did we get? How much help did we get? And I think that it's important for people to see that benefit. They hopefully feel better afterwards. If they see real benefit, hopefully they feel better than the next time they see that their paycheck has a bunch of money missing from it that went to the federal government. They think, oh, well, we get a lot from that too. But right now, it's a big question mark.
We're talking here about the 74% of grants that can't be tracked. What about the 26% that maybe can? What are they doing right?
So the majority of that 26% that can be tracked, it's good reporting on those prime awards. It's that they've been able to attach some local place of performance information to that prime award. So it's that the federal government is doing a little bit better job. There's some transportation programs, like some of those highway ones, highway planning and construction. They're doing a better job of not just giving one big payment to the state, but breaking it up into project payments. So they can literally say it's for this road in this community. And not all of it, but a much bigger percentage. And so that's what we're getting. But the subawards really not working for almost any programs out there, as far as we can tell, not consistently. And that's how the grant successes that we were able to see, that 26%. I hesitate to use the word success because it's such a small one, but that's where they've done better.
Sean, this administration is looking to increase the scrutiny of grant awards before they're approved, specifically by political appointees in the chain of command. Your report looks at accountability after the money leaves federal agencies. Where do you think the federal government has the larger accountability gap today? Is it on the approval side or the accounting side?
It's a great question. I think the accounting side is a bigger gap right now. Not that we can't do better about detecting fraud before it happens. There have been recommendations after all the COVID spending, things like that, things that we can prove. I balk at political appointees reviewing because I'm not sure that's about fraud and mismanagement. I think it's about a political agenda, and those change administration after administration. It's just probably not an effective way to manage money. But fraud, that stays the same administration after administration. There is fraud, and we do need to detect it, hopefully before the money gets spent. But even at its worst, fraud is a small percentage, as it turns out. It always is small percentage of federal spending. But on the accounting side, as you can see, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that we have very limited accounting for. One of the things we haven't mentioned on the direct payments, they had good information on where they went, but there were three major programs, three Medicare programs that were over $1 trillion that have systemic problems in their reporting every year about their location. The location information is there, but when we looked at it, we knew it was wrong, highly wrong. And so we had to give them credit because of our methodology. They filled that information in, but we knew it was wrong. And that's $1 trillion. And we look back 10 years and it was wrong every year. The patterns were all off. And so there's a lot of very big improvements, a lot of money that we are missing good accountability for on the after we spend it side.
Sean Moulton is Senior Policy Analyst at the Project on Government Oversight. Sean, I always appreciate you being here. Thanks for walking us through the headlines here.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview along with a link to this report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, before heading home for August, the Senate cleared a few items that could have lasting consequences. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Senate left Washington without resolving every major issue on its agenda, but it did advance several priorities, including nominations, Russia sanctions, and a continuing resolution to keep the government funded. Mitchell Miller joins me now with a look at what got done before the August recess. Mitchell, great to have you back. Thanks for joining me.
Great to be back.
Senate got a lot done last week. They didn't quite finish everything, but they did make some pretty good headway. Let's start there. The continuing resolution was maybe at the top of the list.
Yes, I think so. I mean, there was such a huge tranche of stuff that they needed to get done. It was really kind of a crazy windup to the whole Senate session. There were times, actually, that many of the lawmakers themselves said they didn't know what was coming up next. But ultimately, as the Senate does, it had a little bit of that Senate magic where they pull everything together at the last second. And the biggest one was definitely the continuing resolution. So that will get potentially the government funded from October 1st through December 11th. And it looks like that will help to potentially avoid a government shutdown. Certainly, that was the reasoning behind getting a CR passed in the middle of summer, which rarely happens. It's always, as you know, coming in the fall. Now, there will be some issues in connection with the House because the House will now have to approve it itself. The House comes back on August 31st. There are a variety of things that are in the Senate version of the continuing resolution that are not in the House version. Just one big example, and these are the kind of things that they're going to have to work out, is the Senate did not include funding for the so-called Trump-class destroyers, which, of course, the White House really wants, and the House does have that money in. So those are the types of things that each chamber is going to have to work out, and we'll have to see if that does indeed avert a government shutdown later this fall.
Well, hopefully House members can read this version while they're out on recess and simplify the conferencing when they come back.
Good beach reading.
Another key accomplishment here, I think, was approving the Russia sanctions bill.
Yeah, this is really interesting because this was a bill that sat for a long, long time in the Senate, much to the frustration of the late South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham and its supporters. Many of them thought that this should have been passed a long time ago. And sadly, it really is because Lindsey Graham died, I think, that this legislation finally made it across the finish line. Members of both parties that had large amounts of bipartisan support had been pushing for this. But until that actually happened, and Lindsey Graham, as we know, was literally pushing for this bill in the days ahead of his death. So this was a really big come together moment in a time when both parties do not come together very often on Friday for them to overwhelmingly pass this on an 86-11 vote. And it imposes tougher sanctions against Russia. Obviously, sanctions have already been in place, but these are specifically aimed at countries that do more of the energy type of trades and getting money from that in connection with Russia. And it also imposes more sanctions on Iran. So a good little kumbaya moment there for the Senate.
One of the other things a lot of folks were watching, Mitchell, was the confirmations, Senate confirmations. They had a bundle of 74 people to get through. Looks like that one made it over the finish line as well.
Right. And this is the type of thing that doesn't get maybe as much attention in the media. But for senators, this is a very big deal to be able to approve this many nominations en blanc, as they say, 74 nominations. Some of these are justices. Some of these are, one of them is an inspector general. There are a variety of very, very important positions that were included in those 74 nominations. And to get them all passed is a big deal. Senate Majority Leader John Thune pointed this out on the floor earlier in the week, saying, kind of pointedly at the White House, hey, look what we've done. We've gotten a lot of your nominations through in the Senate in record time, and they're close to record levels. So this is, again, a big deal for the Senate leadership.
Even though that list had 74 names on it, probably the most visible confirmation hearing was still around Todd Blanche for Attorney General.
Yes, and of course, we had a lot of drama related to that on Friday morning. Everybody was wondering what was going to happen because Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski announced that she was definitely not going to support Todd Blanche for a variety of reasons, including his handling of the Epstein files, the anti-weaponization fund, and a variety of other things. And then only hours later, the person who could only get this across at this point, because Maine's Susan Collins had also said that she would not vote for Blanche, was Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, of course, who has his own history with the president, having been forced out of his office eventually due to a primary earlier in the year when the president supported his primary opponent. Still, when he got on the floor, he said that this is not about his issues with the president. It's really about confirming Todd Blanche. And so he got very emotional right at the very end of his speech on the floor, where he outlined the reasons why, even though he doesn't think Blanche is perfect, he really thinks that he is probably better than anybody else that the president might choose in his stead. And he said, as his voice started to crack, that he feels like he did the right thing on behalf of his constituents. But certainly a lot of drama related to that fight. And it really held up a lot of the issues that we've just been talking about, because they just didn't know which way things were going to go. But eventually things were cleared for Todd Blanche to be the permanent Attorney General for President Trump.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, one of the other sets of conversations, I guess may be the best way to frame it, has been around defense munitions supplies and funding for that. We've talked about this in regards to the reconciliation bill and the defense supplemental, but Secretary Hegseth was on the Hill last week talking about this. What are you hearing in terms of the received truth about current levels of defense munitions?
Well, to be frank, there's a lot of skepticism among lawmakers, particularly on the Senate side, related to his claims that there is no problem with the munitions, that they have not been dropped, that they are... there are reports that they are down by as much as 80%. We had the report in the Washington Post that there was a back and forth between the president and Defense Secretary Hegseth over this, that the president was reportedly mad about. Of course, the White House denied all of this. But if you talk to lawmakers, and I talked to Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who is on the Senate Armed Services Committee, he said it is a big concern for the committee and for the members of that panel. And he says they are going to look into it to try to get to the bottom of what's been happening. And he said, essentially, everybody really believes that at the start of the war, the administration wanted to go big, and a lot of munitions were used during those early days and months of the war. And there were lawmakers early on saying, wait a second, how can you go at this level? So now all of that is coming back to roost. And I think the lawmakers are trying to really figure out what are they going to do, because they know that this is not a good thing when you're trying to negotiate with Iran. So they understand why the White House is probably pushing back on these reports, but they do believe that they are true. And this is a real big issue, because you can't just ramp up, 3 or 4 years worth of munitions. Some of these larger systems, defense systems, literally take years to get into place. So that's something to watch as we move forward in the weeks and months ahead.
How does this lead into the conversation then about the NDAA and defense appropriations and the supplemental?
I think it's one of many very complicating issues, because Congress is still wrestling with how to come up with additional money that the White House wants. That was one of the things that the Senate did not get done. The White House still wants close to $70 billion in supplemental for the war with Iran. And then, as I was speaking with Senator Kaine, he's pointing out, well, they also want $1.5 trillion, which is, for the overall budget, a 40% increase in the defense budget. And this is somebody, Senator Kaine, whose state relies heavily on defense dollars. But he and many Democrats and some Republicans have some real skepticism about where all this money is going to come from. And then, of course, the NDAA got caught up in the politics of all this, even though, as we both know, it usually gets passed with widespread bipartisan support. But because of the opposition to the war and how it's been actually prosecuted and what's been happening, that causes more problems in terms of whether these funds are going to get approved and when the NDAA is actually going to get passed.
That's Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thanks so much for joining me today.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from ABC News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.
Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, August 10th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, as Washington debates the future of the civil service, one legal scholar argues that a professional career workforce is more consistent with conservative principles than many people think. Plus, the federal government can track an award from Washington to a state government, but following it the rest of the way is often where the trail goes cold. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. NASA's successful demonstration of laser communications during the Artemis II mission marked a turning point for a technology that has been in development for years. It proved that optical communications can support human spaceflight operations, sending high-resolution imagery and scientific data as 4 astronauts traveled around the moon. Nikki Desch is the project manager for the Orion Artemis II optical communication payload system at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. She talked about the capabilities with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis.
Throughout the mission, it was responsible for downloading up to 484 gigabytes of data, including high-res imagery, high-definition videos, mass amounts of science data, as well as engineering data that was used by scientists and engineers throughout the mission, and was also shared with the world in the form of pictures and videos and live streams.
Yeah, amazing. And you described it a little bit, but for those who are not familiar, talk a little bit about the system, its benefits, kind of the limitations it's been trying to overcome, how long NASA has been working on it, and why it's so important to the Artemis mission.
The O2O system has been in development since 2017. It was part of a larger effort to advance the technology readiness of optical communication payloads for various types of space applications, including from LEO from low Earth orbiting satellites, geostationary satellites, as well as lunar applications. The importance of O2O in optical communications is that it provides a high data rate capability. As our science instruments continue to advance in their ability to collect data, they become more sensitive. Then that means that they're collecting significantly more data throughout their mission lifetime, and that is also true for human spaceflight. Because of that, there is a need to actually download significantly more data today than there ever was before. What optical communications does is it provides a way to download these extremely high, large volumes of data using a payload that takes up significantly less space, and it weighs less and uses less power than traditional radio frequency systems. That being said, though, it does have some challenges. The traditional radio frequency systems, while they are not able to transmit nearly as much data as optical communications in the same amount of time frame, radio frequency systems can be available 24/7, and they're not limited by atmospheric effects as optical communications is. Because optical communications uses infrared technology and infrared lasers to transmit these high data rates, the signals do often get impacted by clouds and other types of atmospheric weather effects. However, that is easily mitigated by having a very diverse ground segment and by having multiple stations, so that the optical communications terminal in space can point to an available ground station should the one that they're communicating with become unavailable.
Let's talk about those ground stations.
Sure.
And you've been working on the development of ground systems. So first, talk to us about the components of the ground system.
An optical ground segment needs to have multiple ground stations, and generally they are geographically diverse. For O2O, we had a ground station at the White Sands Complex in New Mexico, one at the Table Mountain facility in Wrightwood, California, as well as one at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. Each of these ground stations has a slightly different design. They have different types of telescopes, but ultimately they're all able to receive the same signal from Orion. And so they're back. So all of their modems are this is probably way too detailed, but CCSDS, high photon efficiency compatible. And so when the data is actually received by the ground station, it gets processed and then is transmitted via our terrestrial networks over to the Johnson Space Center Mission Control Center.
There are a total of 2 ground stations.
So there were 2 that were baseline for the mission.
Right.
Those were the Table Mountain facility and the White Sands Complex. However, we partnered with Australian National University to include them as an experimental station, since this is something that they were building up independently from, as part of a collaboration with NASA, but something that they were building up on their own, and we wanted to include them in this partnership and in this demonstration.
Oh, that's cool. How did that go?
It went excellent. They worked the first time. They supported data rates up to 260 megabits per second, which was the maximum for O2O. And their ground station performed excellent.
Amazing. Are there plans to build out more ground stations in the future?
So there is definitely a need to have more optical ground infrastructure, but it doesn't necessarily have to be NASA's ground infrastructure. It could be partners with other space agencies, as well as commercial providers. I'm aware of a number of companies that are exploring or have built up optical ground capabilities that support low Earth orbiting satellites and their optical communication signals, payloads.
You also talked a little bit about the challenges, but it's been a very lengthy process. Could you maybe expand on some of the challenges that you had to overcome when building those ground systems?
One of the biggest challenges is the pointing. It requires very precise pointing to a very small, refined spot in the sky. When the space terminal is actually able to point on the ground, when they're at lunar distances, that beam is the size of about 6 kilometers in diameter. It's very, very narrow. So being able to have the ground station precisely point and transmit a beacon up to the space terminal, to then have the space terminal then precisely point back, see and acknowledge that the ground station beacon and precisely point back to the ground terminal is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult, and it's especially difficult for lunar distances. It's much more challenging than it would be for LEO or even geo type missions. So that's one of the biggest challenges.
That's Nikki Desch, project manager for the Artemis II optical communication payload system at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Watch her full conversation with Anastasia Obis at federalnewsnetwork.com. It's part of our Space and Satellite Exchange. Up next, as Washington debates the future of civil service, one legal scholar argues that a professional career workforce is more consistent with conservative principles than many people think. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.